Guys, this is awful. I just recorded this whole video for you guys on Colonial Society, the last real video of our unit, and I realized my camera was on. And you guys don't want my camera on right now, not when your teacher has COVID. My voice is bad enough right now. You don't need to see me all COVID out. So I gotta start it all over. So bear with me here. Talking is not the easiest right now, so we'll probably be brief. Um, so there's two essential questions left, and I'm trying to address them in this video because as Americans we're efficient. Remember that? All right. So how did the economic development of the colonies alter patterns of social prestige and wealth? Well, that's not an easy question to answer. That's a highfalutin, fancy question. Why is it difficult? Well, for one, is because the colonies were diverse. And the social prestige and wealth going on in the South was different than the middle colonies, was different than the New England colonies. So let's give an overview here. So we're looking here at the changes between the 1600s and the 1700s. And what's happening is that by the 1700s, slavery is increasing in the South. And in the 1600s, for the most part, of course there's exceptions, but there was a rough equality of all the people there. Like it was basically just rough for everybody. And everyone was pretty much living in some level in poverty. And in that poverty, there was an equality. Well, now as these farms are growing and as slavery is increasing, this helps create a different social structure, if you will. Excuse me. I'm enjoying some kombucha here to try to talk. So as some own more slaves, those people acquire more wealth. And then a few families in what was Virginia owned large amounts of land. You might even want to call them clans. And these large families, so there's only a few families that owned lots of the land, and they dominated the House of Burgesses. That house should probably be a capital H, by the way. So does that mean that your wealth and the amount of land you owned influenced your political standing? Pretty much, right? We had the beginnings of democracy here, but we were not democratic yet. Now, these wealthy people, were still different than, say, English gentlemen. They wanted to still show that they were different, but they still had higher social status. So if you were to make a pyramid, if you will, of the social structure of the South, at the time, you would have the planters. These were the people that owned large amounts of land. They probably owned plantations, probably owned lots of slaves. Under them, you have small farmers. They own smaller tracts of land. They probably owned one or two slaves. And most people fell into that social category. Most white people, anyway, I should say, depending on the colonies. Remember, some colonies, like South Carolina, had more slaves than actual white colonists. Below them, you have landless whites. Many of them were former indentured servants, but not all. They often worked for other farmers. Then you had indentured servants, and then at the bottom, slaves. Now, in the 1600s, there were many indentured servants and not as many slaves. By the 1700s, you have few to none indentured servants and many slaves. Remember that chart we showed of the population increasing from the 16 to 1700s and how slavery increased, right? You may want to look back to that. The South did not have a lot of established urban centers, not many cities. Yeah, you had Charleston, but not like as many as up north. And therefore, you didn't have the social class of like the lawyers and the financiers. The wealthy were mostly just the landowners. Most of the transportation was done by water, whether it be the bay, the ocean, or commonly rivers. The roads were a mess and not very well, kept down there. And they remained that way for, probably through the 1900s, most people would argue. Hey, New England is different in many ways. Think of the different in the presidencies of like an Adams and a Jefferson and how they were just so different in nature. And a lot of it you can contribute to just where they were from. The average life expectancy for most men in New England was 70, which is pretty good for that time. A few reasons: the land the geography. The air was cooler, so germs did not spread as easily as it did in the South. The water was generally cleaner. In the New England, many families immigrated together, whereas in, say, Virginia, you have lots of individuals going over to migrate. Many of them were men, right? So in the South, men way outnumbered the women. I think it was like 6-1 for a while. Whereas many whole families came over together in New England to give you just a whole different type of society, a different experience. Many of the women got married by their young 20s, started having children. They would have an average of a child every 2 years. They would have an average of 10 children. 8 lived to adulthood usually, which was pretty good numbers back then. It became worse in other parts in our history. So you have these large families. You also have these multi-generational families where the grandparents and are help raising the youth. And there's this saying that the grandparent, the idea of a grandparent, was invented in New England. Now that might be a little ethnocentric. I'm sure other cultures outside of the Americas had the ideas of the grandparent. You may live with grandparents, or your grandparents may have had a large role in raising you. That was common in New England. Women did not have many property rights in New England. I guess they thought it would be a conflict with the men, whereas in the South, they did have some property rights because there weren't many women to begin with. But in New England, if you got married, you lost your property rights, and usually would go to your husband. If your husband died, it would go to another male heir. All right, social status. Despite there being no official form of nobility or aristocrats, many tried to recreate the experience of social status from the old world, being Europe. You can see here in this painting, this is of Ralph Izard and his wife. I don't know her first name. They were a wealthy merchant family from Charleston. This was painted by Copley. That's his last name. I don't remember his first name, but a famous painter at the time. They had this painting done in Italy. Right, that's the Colosseum in the background. This alone tells you that they were wealthy because they were traveling around Italy, right? Not most colonialists, colonials were not doing this. But look at their clothing, look at the chair they're on, and the table they're at. What was this paper they were looking at? Was this like, this is all my money? Look here, written down, this is all my money. Oh, let me see your list of money, because we have so much money. I don't know if that's what they're looking at, but they're showing that they're wealthy and they're showing off a little bit. Look at some of the techniques in the artwork. If you had me as a freshman, you may remember some of those. But there was a resentment against many of these upper class. Hey, we're in America. We don't have aristocrats here. Slow down, stay in your lane there, people. And there were some rebellions. There were examples of rebellions against what emerged as an upper class in the Americas. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, the last question here, what were the basic features of colonial politics, including the role of various official and informal political institutions? I'm going to give you just a very brief idea of this. We'll break this down enough. We'll talk some more as we get closer to this revolution you guys want to learn about. All right, so this is by 1775. This changes, or I shouldn't say this changes. Not every colony kept the same type of government all its years there was a colony. I put an asterisk next to New Hampshire and Maryland because right away the first one in each category changed. New Hampshire used to be a proprietary colony, and it changed into a royal government. Others changed, not just those two. But at 1775, right before the Revolution, this is what it looked like. 8 or 9 of the colonies, what I got there, 3, I don't know, had, is that 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, 8 colonies had royal governments that the king gave them. New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, both Carolinas, Georgia, and Massachusetts. And the king who gave it to many of them was pictured there, Mr. Skinny Legs, King Charles II. Some had governors that got that land as by proprietor. I can't say that word today. That means that the king owed someone money, like there was a debt. So instead of paying you this money, I'm going to give you this land, and you can make a heck of a lot more money. Remember, we discussed that's how William Penn got Pennsylvania because the king owed his father money, right? Like, why doesn't a king owe me money? I want a state. That would be cool. All right, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were examples of that. Lastly, we have self-governing colonies. They've changed status over time, but by 1775, Rhode Island and Connecticut were both self-governing colonies. So self-governing colonies, including Rhode Island and Connecticut, formed when the king granted a charter to a joint stock company, right? Like, oh, you want to make some money? Yeah, make some money for us, but here's some land. And the company could then set up its own government independent of the crown. So you could basically make up your own rules, but that's like within parameters. If the crown was like, yeah, but we don't like what you're doing, they could always revoke that and make it a royal colony. All right. So a lot of us, we don't realize that the 13 colonies were not all the same type of governments. You may remember that image that is of Roger Williams. Remember, he interacted a lot with the natives. He didn't like the way some of the people in New England were making shady deals with the natives. He even wrote a book on some of their languages. And remember, he was kicked out of Massachusetts for his crazy ideas. And that's how he helped set up Rhode Island. Remember Anne Hutchinson? Remember all that? All right. So that's it. I went through this briefly. I hope that's okay with you. If you have questions, please let me know. We'll talk about more colonial stuff as we get closer to the revolution, which will be a very fun unit. All right. Stay safe, everyone.